Some stories don't begin with a murder. They begin with a word loaded with judgment, printed in an old newspaper and attached to a woman or a man's name. A word that tells us what a community feared, what it condemned, and sometimes how it explained the violence that followed. In 19th-century Kentucky newspapers, those words were often blunt: disreputable, debauch, house of ill repute, notorious woman, bagnio. They were words meant to carry shame. But when we followed those words through the records of Pulaski County and the surrounding region, we found something more complicated than scandal. We found what history keeps showing us, from the ancient world to today: drinking, fighting, moral judgment, and sometimes people taking the law into their own hands. And the women whose reputations became part of the story before the facts had fully settled. This isn't a local story of one murder, it's a pattern. And this time we began searching the pattern on the east end of Pulaski County. On November 22nd, 1866, the Courier-Journal out of Louisville published a dispatch under the headline, "Row in Somerset." The subheading was a little sharper: "A drunken revel, killing of a self-constituted officer." The report came from Somerset and described something that had happened the previous Thursday night at Flat Lick. According to the Courier-Journal, a group of men had gathered at what the paper called a disreputable house. The purpose, the paper said, was debauch. The article did not give the woman's name. It did not identify the householder, but the language points clearly toward a house of ill repute. Then, in the middle of the night, the paper says a black man entered the house carrying a pistol. Using mocking language, the newspaper reported that he placed one of the men under what it called a formal arrest. The armed man held his prisoner for a while, but eventually he fell asleep. The accused man escaped. Then he found a pistol of his own. The prisoner woke his captor, told him he was now ready to face him, and shot him through the heart. The newspaper didn't give the dead man's name. It didn't identify the shooter, but it did preserve the setting, which was Flat Lick. The area is about 10 miles northeast of Somerset. We started by trying to pinpoint the old houses of ill repute of Pulaski County. These houses were called many things over the years, including bawdy houses. Flat Lick gave us one of the first documented clues, but the record is thin. No clear names and no full court record located. These were the kinds of places that could be well known locally without leaving much of a public record. In 1866, only a year after the Civil War ended, this region was still unsettled. Firearms were not just weapons, they were tools, and almost everyone carried one. Civil authority was still being developed, and sometimes sketchy at best. That is the first layer of this episode. The second is reputation. By the 1880s, reputation could shape a newspaper story almost as much as the facts themselves. Not so different from today, except perhaps in how likely a newspaper was to be sued for it. One Pulaski County woman shows exactly how that worked. Her story was filled with the language of scandal. Her name was Mary Eads. She was also known as Mary James. On May 25, 1882, the Daily American in Nashville reported that police had arrested Mary Eads, alias James, at Emma Hedges' bagnio on North College Street in Somerset. She was accused of murdering a man identified in the reports as Samuel, or possibly Smith, Burton near Somerset, Kentucky, about 3 months earlier. When a reporter visited her, Mary gave her version of what happened. She said there had been a gathering, heavy drinking, and that Burton had become violent, beating his nephew and a woman. Mary said Burton turned on her with an axe. She said someone handed her a knife. When he drew back to strike, she stabbed him and ran. Her account was one of self-defense. Mary said she had not wanted to flee. She wanted to stay and stand trial, but others persuaded her to leave until the public excitement had died down. She described being taken over the Mill Springs knobs at night, walking through mud and woods, terrified that Burton might still be alive and following her. Mary said she feared being lynched if she returned to Somerset. She claimed there were men in that locality who cared no more for a woman than they did for a dog. Later, the story grew stranger. On September 6, 1882, the Cincinnati Post described Mary as a woman of vile character and reported allegations of official misconduct. The report claimed that Pulaski County Sheriff Samuel Tate had written to Mary, telling her to remain hidden until a reward was offered, then surrender so they could divide the money. Mary's trial came in October 1882. The first jury could not reach a verdict, and the case was tried again. By then, Mary was reportedly in the final stages of consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. She was ultimately acquitted. But even after her acquittal, newspapers continued to define Mary through scandal and reputation. And that same pattern appears again in the story of a woman called Vic Dobbs. 1 year before Mary was accused, on May 27, 1881, the Interior Journal reported a killing near Somerset, somewhere between town and the depot. The men involved were William Durham and James Mullaney. The paper blamed the dispute on a notorious woman called Vic Dobbs, and that is nearly all it tells us about her. We get no account from Vic herself, not even her age, but it did say she had figured in 1 or 2 killings before. With that single line, the newspaper tied Vic to earlier violence without explaining what role, if any, she had actually played. What the reports tell us is that Durham and Mullaney fought, and Durham was badly beaten. He went home. Then his brother Sanford went after Mullaney to avenge him, and Mullaney beat him too. The two brothers then tried together to do what neither had managed alone. But Mullaney drew a pistol and shot William Durham through the brain. Mullaney was sentenced to 2 years in the penitentiary, but the story did not end there. In 1885, James Mullaney was shot and killed at a dance in Barren Fork, an area that is today in McCreary County, but was part of southern Pulaski at the time. Vic Dobbs may have been named as the cause, but the continuing record follows the men. Her reputation opens the story. The violence, retaliation, and consequences carry it forward. That brings us to the final pin in this story. This one happened outside Pulaski County, but it shows how the language of morality and the reality of violence often traveled together. In November 1869, a little over a decade before Vic and Mary's story, and only a few years after the Flat Lick incident, a group of regulators went to a house of ill fame near Crab Orchard Springs in Lincoln County, intending to tear it down. But the people inside were prepared to defend it. The regulators opened fire with Spencer rifles and mortally wounded George Tankersley, whom the newspaper described as an inmate of the house, meaning an occupant or resident. The word regulators is important here. These were not neutral lawmen. In 19th-century Kentucky, the term could refer to self-appointed groups enforcing their own version of order, sometimes through vigilante violence. So the Crab Orchard case reveals another layer. The regulators set out to destroy a house they considered immoral. Their crusade ended with a man mortally wounded. Flat Lick gives us a killing inside a disreputable house, and a glimpse into how race shaped the language newspapers used to describe the people involved. Mary Eads James gives us a woman accused of murder who was ultimately acquitted while her character remained on trial in the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, Vic Dobbs shows how reputation could be used to explain violence without ever establishing responsibility. And then, Crab Orchard shows how some people responded to what they considered moral disorder in their communities. The old newspapers often framed these stories through scandal, but scandal is not the same thing as truth. A word like debauch or debauchery did more than describe a scene. It shaped how readers understood everything that followed. When they wrote Notorious Woman, they showed how easily reputation could stand in for evidence. And when they wrote about regulators, they were recording a world where rough justice often operated outside the law. That is what connects these stories. Not the scandal itself, but the pattern beneath it. Drinking, conflict, reputation, violence. And the ways people tried to explain what happened afterward. And again, people were left dead while newspapers and readers reached their own verdicts in the court of public opinion. And if these stories leave you wondering how many more Southern Kentucky scandalous mysteries are still hiding in old newspapers, courthouse files, and family memories, this is not the end of the trail. In a future episode, we'll cross into Rockcastle County for one of the most haunting stories we've found so far. The so-called Scarlet Woman of Roundstone, and the violent history tied to a Rockcastle bawdy house. Do you know more about these stories? Or stories like them? Leave us a comment. We are still trying to pin a map of these old houses of ill repute once known in this region, and would love to hear if you know of any. This has been Hometown Murders and Mysteries. Follow us on Facebook at Lake Cumberland Tactical Innovations, or on TikTok and YouTube at Somerset Sleuths 25 for more Southern Kentucky history and mysteries. Follow, like, and share to help us keep local history alive. For more detail about the stories we share publicly, find us on Facebook and ask about our subscriber group. As always, thanks for watching.